All right, welcome back. Okay, so now we want to evaluate the domain of each of these functions. Now, when you're talking about log functions, remember the properties, characteristics of the basic log function, right? There's an asymptote at what? There's an asymptote at the y-axis, right? There's a vertical asymptote at x equals 0. And so what does that mean if you think about the basic function? It means that the domain is always positive. It's all positive real numbers, right? So let's look at these. So before I go in, what does that mean? It means that whatever goes into the function can't be negative and it can't be 0, right? So to figure out the domain, what we have to do is what values can go into this argument, into this function, right? It doesn't matter whether it's a log base 2, natural log, or common log. We cannot have any values that go into the argument that are 0 or negative, okay? So in other words, what we're going to do is we're going to solve each of these arguments, right? So each of these arguments we need to solve for the inequality of what? Being what? Greater than 0. Right? And so if we solve this inequality, then we solved for the domain. Because any value that any solution of x that makes this true is in the domain. So let's figure out what x has to be. So in this case here, if I solve for the inequality, I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides, right? So that's going to give me 2x is greater than negative 4. And if I divide by 2 on both sides of the inequality, I get x is greater than what? Negative 2. So that's the domain. The domain is all x values that are greater than negative 2. Okay, cool. So the domain for this one is what? It's going to be, negative 2 to positive infinity. Okay, so now I'm going to do the same thing, right? So I need to solve 5 minus x being greater than 0. Right? So now if I solve for this, I subtract 5 from both sides and I get negative x, right? So if I want to change this to a plus negative, so I get negative x is greater than negative 5. Now if in this case here I'm going to divide by negative 1, I don't want negative x, so I'm going to divide both sides by negative 1, but if I divide by a negative number, so anytime you're dealing with inequalities, whenever you divide or multiply both sides by a negative number, you must flip the inequality. So if I do that, then this becomes x is less than 5. And that is the domain. So the domain of b, the domain of the natural log of 5 minus x is going to be all values that are less than 5. So that means the domain is going to be everything from negative infinity to 5. All right, finally, let's look at this one. So again, I want to find all values where x squared minus 9 is what? Greater than 0. So I'm going to add 9 to both sides. And so I get x squared is greater than 9. Okay? Now, in this case here, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So if I take the square root of both sides, I get x is less or greater than plus or minus 3. So that means as long as x is greater than negative or positive 3, then this is, then it's in the domain. But here's the thing. In order to be greater than, if x is greater than negative 3, if you include greater than negative 3, if you say greater than negative 3, you also include positive 3 in there. Okay, so what that means here is the only values that will make this negative are the values that are in between. Let me think about this. Let's see here. Actually, no. Let me backtrack, because I'm either. Let me think here. Let me think. How do I want to do this? Got to be careful here, because if I say I'm greater than yeah, so be careful here. So here, let me do one more step. So here, what you're saying is x is less than or equal to plus or minus 3, but you got to be careful here, because this is also meaning that plus or minus x is greater than 3. So when you're saying x is greater than 3, plus or minus 3, you got to be careful, because what this actually is saying is x is greater than 3 or x is less than negative 3, because we can put the plus minus on the x. Okay? Because we're dealing with an inequality, you got to be careful. Okay? If it was an equation, we're just solving an equation, it doesn't matter. But since we're dealing with inequality, just remember, you got to be careful here with the plus or minus. Okay? So and it's easy to check too, because if I was to interpret that as x being greater than plus or minus 3, and I say, well, if I'm greater than negative 3, then I'm also going to be greater than negative 3, or positive 3. But remember, just check a point. If I put negative 2 in here, negative 2 doesn't work. So, but if I put any value that's greater than 3 or less than negative 3, then I will get something that is positive. Okay? So the domain for this one will be, again, an interval notation will be what? Negative infinity to negative 3, union 3 to positive infinity. All right. Have a great day.